Hi everyone, back in the locker room at the whiteboard again. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about mental health. We're going to take an example of how people can get into sort of mental illness, and particularly going to deal with personality disorder, kind of the secondary, even tertiary level of mental health issues. I think it's pretty intuitive how pro-inflammatory cytokines can lead to particularly chronic physical illness and disease. It's a little bit less intuitive as to how they have a role on mental illness and disease, but at the root of all mental illness and disease, whether it be addictions, personality disorders, affective disorders, anxiety disorders, explosive disorders, attention deficit disorder. At the root of all of these is a hyperactive chronic threat stress response, and the sequelae of that, which, as we've talked about, kind of comes out through these pro-inflammatory cytokines that activate a lot of systems in our body. With that, we'll step up to the board and do a very quick review of threats, and also a little bit of neuroanatomy review again today, and then get right into what we're going to discuss is the narcissistic personality disorder and beyond, actually. So here we go. Again, our quick review here is that physical threats are things like lions, tigers, bears, other people attacking us, infections like viruses, bacteria, and parasites. Undergoing a physical attack can exacerbate a mental illness or addiction as part of that spectrum, but that's really not what we're talking about today. We're talking a little bit more about the spirit, and when I say a spiritual attack or spiritual pain and suffering, I am including the more well known sort of aspect of spirituality and our connection to things beyond us, including faith and religion. But I'm also talking about our internal spirit, and our sense of self and our sense of wholeness and spiritual wellness inside. So spiritual attacks can be an emotional attack, a social attack, a financial attack, and we've talked a fair amount of about those things. But again, if you're living in poverty, that affects your spirit. If you are a minority, perhaps disenfranchised or demeaned or discriminated against or terrorized, that is an extreme spiritual attack. And we know even with a minor social rejection will elevate our interleukin-6 levels. It'll elevate our pro-inflammatory cytokines. So some people in this world and in our communities have a massive sort of load of spiritual threat and spiritual attacks, and that is going to elevate their pro-inflammatory cytokines. And as we've said, an elevation in pro-inflammatory cytokines is associated with every mental health disorder, including addictions, that we have. So we need to keep that in mind. And we always talk about the shadowy part of our brain, the predictive codes, that they're biased towards threat, perhaps based on our past history, will activate our threat stress response. We talk about traumatic memories can pop up and activate our threat stress response. Today we're going to talk even a little bit more about these suppressions and repressions, the suppressed thoughts and the repressed emotions that we like to compartmentalize and stuff away and ignore and not deal with. They cause anxiety or maybe anger or some emotion we just don't want to feel, and we don't want to deal with it. So we kind of ignore it, we set it aside and don't get back to it, and that energy kind of stores within us. And one of the strategies that we use to sort of repress those emotions when they bubble up. If we're feeling anxious or angry or something like that is bubbling up, is what I call, excuse me, illusion of control. Oh, that's not COVID. No, it doesn't go to the nose. Illusion of control strategies. So those are personality strategies, and that can blow up into full-blown personality disorders. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But let's go to the brain real quick. Remember, the amygdala is kind of the hub of the threat response, and when it senses threat coming from any one of these things, kind of does the same thing and activates a number of brain structures, including our adrenal gland through the hypothalamus to the pituitary down to the adrenal gland. But more specifically, what we're talking about today is the outflow of pro-inflammatory cytokines, those cytokines that come out under threat that we've termed threogens before. So let's keep that in mind. And let's also keep in mind as we're going through this that under an attack in fight or flight, we are going to only use structures that are absolutely needed for fight or flight. So that tends to be a little bit more of our primitive brain. We need our muscles, we need our heart, we need our lungs. So a lot of resources get devoted to those tissues, and then we shut down a lot of other structures. We shut down our gut almost completely under stress, and we're not as hungry, and if we try to eat, it doesn't settle well. We can get constipated under chronic stress, and it can get worse as it goes on. But we shut down a lot of structures, including a big part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that makes us very distinctly human. It's the evolutionary part of the brain that kind of took us beyond every other species. This dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is responsible for our intellect and our creativity, our advanced thinking. And this ventral medial prefrontal cortex is responsible essentially for us to be social and bond and connect. And as I've stated before, we're kind of a wimpy species. So if we can't cooperate, if we can't bond and connect with people and cooperate with them, we don't fare very well. If you put us as an isolated human being out in the jungle, we're not going to survive very long. We need our tribe with us, and to remain part of a tribe, we have to understand all those social connections, and that part of the brain does that, but it goes offline when we're under threat, and that makes some sense because if you're being attacked by a tiger, well, it's not time to figure out how to invent a wheel or invent something else or create a musical instrument. And it's really not a time to bond, connect, have sex, things like that. So our physiology is very much determined by whether we're under threat or whether we feel safe in the world. So let's go over here and just look at fight, what the physiology of fight. This is basically a physiology of anger. We are aggressive and we are reactive, we're not contemplative, and we're self-centered. And fight actually can feel pretty good because it has a fair amount of dopamine in it, and dopamine is a feel-good neurotransmitter. It makes us want to approach things. Whether we're in breed mode, dopamine wants us to approach for perhaps the opportunity of connecting and having sex. But if we're in threat mode, if we're in fight mode, dopamine makes us more likely to be aggressive and attack. Now, if we think we're going to lose the fight, or if we are losing the fight, that dopamine level will fall. Our predominant neurotransmitter then becomes noradrenaline. It's a adrenaline-like substance, just you can note by the name of it. And in that state, we don't have that same confidence, that same aggressiveness. We are flightier, right? We're more fearful. We're going to be more self-protective and less aggressive. We're going to be more reactive and jumpy. We're going to run and dodge and dart, but we're going to be very vigilant. We're going to watch our environment for threat, and we tend to be quite anxious when we are in flight or our fear response. So we're going to come back to these two neurotransmitters in a second, and kind of their importance in personality disorders. So let's talk about what we aren't when we are in fight and flight, because that's really important. So if our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex goes offline, we have a difficulty with attention, concentration, and memory. We have poor reasoning, we have poor planning, poor strategizing, poor insight, poor judgment, poor flexibility, and poor creativity. We tend to be very prone to mispredictions, misperceptions, prejudices, and we tend to be quite rigid, okay? So that you could flip that around and say, this part of the brain is responsible for increasing all of that. We've shut it down, and so we're, intellectually really quite stifled when the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex goes offline. Has some real implication for learning, and particularly in children. Now, when the ventral medial prefrontal cortex goes offline, we have difficulty connecting, we have difficulty bonding, we do not have empathy, that sense of being able to feel what somebody else is feeling is missing. We have more trouble even reading faces or reading posture to interpret how other people are feeling. We don't have remorse, we lose our morality. We have more difficulty with conflict resolution. The decision making around conflict gets very difficult for us. We lose our sociability. We're not pro-social. This part of the brain makes us pro-social. When we're safe, we're very pro-social. When we're under threat, we are not. So we look selfish, we look intolerant, we are antisocial, and we can be paranoid when we're under threat. Okay, so before we've talked about how this thing could, if this is super active, you can see things like explosive disorder, or oppositional disorder, or rage disorder, whatever you want to call that. When flight is more dominant, you see more things like anxiety disorders and panic disorders. But in all of these, you tend to see also attention deficit disorder. These are both highly, we're motivated to be moving, either fighting or fleeing. So poor attention, but increased motor activity, so hyperactivity. So attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity disorder kind of fall into that. So just having the fight or flight responses hyperactive can lead to certain psychiatric and behavioral type diagnoses. Okay, so let's flip over to this side of the board, and we're going to get to the personality type that we wanted to talk about. And remember, the personality traits are things that we do that kind of give us an illusion of control in the world, and it's important for us to have, we feel it's important for us to have an illusion or to sense we're in control in the world, because it helps quell our anxiety, it helps control our emotions, it helps us to function day to day. And so we like to have a strategy by which we, if there are some aversive emotions that bubble up in us during the day, we have strategies by which we can push them away so that we don't, fall apart in the middle of the day. And I've said before, if you feel like you need control in a situation, it's probably an indication you need to set a boundary more than you need to control it, because control blows up on us. We're not very good at controlling ourselves. When we try to control ourselves, we get a lot of internal noise going on kind of in the shadows of the brain that eventually pops up in physical illness and mental illness. And when we try to control other people, that's just an illusion. We can't control other people. We can't really control the world. We can't control the weather. We can't control Mother Nature. So we have to give in to the fact that we don't have that much control in the world. But nevertheless, to quell our anxiety, we like to establish control. So we're talking about the narcissistic personality, and their method of control is primarily to exert power over other people, sometimes at all costs. So, a lot of the personality disorders are about controlling other people, and some of the personality disorders are about, trying to control ourselves. This one is about trying to control other people. Where does that come from? Well, part of that probably comes up in childhood, and I'm not a mental health professional, but my understanding of this type of a personality and why it leads people to want, power over others, it stems from very transactional relationship with parents, where it is perceived that they get love only by doing good acts and being perfect. And I think the other part of it is, although internally within their own home, they may be severely criticized and punished if they've done something wrong for the public to see. The parents will basically say, geez, I don't think little Donnie did anything wrong here, and create this illusion for the public of sort of the perfect child and the perfect family, which sometimes is very much far from the truth. So they're learning that they need to be perfect, which is impossible. And they're also learning that they don't need to be accountable to the world. If you create an appropriate image for the world, you don't need to be accountable. And I do always reflect back on John Wooden saying discipline is an act of love, and that what kids need is they do need to be held accountable. They do need boundaries, but it always needs to be done, particularly if they've done something wrong, and holding them accountable as an act of love, simply saying, you did something wrong, you need to be accountable for it. This is how you're going to be accountable for it. But everybody does wrong stuff. I still value you. I still love you, which is very different than how typically the parents of a narcissistic personality disorder treat their children. So the evolution of this usually comes out of childhood. Kind of as children and adolescents, they're probably trying multiple different personality strategies or illusion of control strategies to get a sense of control and calm in their world. And if this one happens to work, it becomes very reinforcing on itself, and it can become very ingrained and very difficult to break. So we'll come back to that in a second. But bottom line is power over others at all costs. And that means it's okay to manipulate and lie. They've probably seen their parents do that a lot in order to promote an image to the world of the family and the child. So they have no trouble manipulating and lying. Frequently they are pathological liars. If they can't control a situation with manipulating and lying, they can become threatening, they can become demeaning, they can be bullying, and they can be frankly abusive. And you have to really have great concern for people who actually live and stay with people who have this disorder. They tend to have very poor boundaries. Now, they may set boundaries with other people in terms of not letting them come into their lane when it's inconvenient for them. They may be very good at that. What they're not good at is respecting other people's boundaries. So they're kind of driving down the road, swerving and crashing into everybody and blaming everybody else for the collisions. So they're poor with boundaries. They're unable to tolerate criticism. That's kind of a hallmark. So whenever they're criticized, they love to turn the tables quickly. They get very artful at turning the tables quickly, and they will move to blaming and scapegoating, and also they will try to portray themselves as victims in any situation that's not going their way. They may not actually feel like victims. Again, this is about projecting images and manipulating. They also tend to be very competitive, and they must win at all costs, okay? And we'll come back to that in a sec as well. They will have a sense of superiority, and they will tend to be grandiose. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. They can have a good social skill set, be self-confident, and very much, engaging and approachable socially, but it's almost more the charm to suck people in, and once they've sucked people in, then they unleash these things on them. Now, getting down to this issue of competition, what they will do is set up their environment so that they are constantly engaging in some form of competition, but they set up their environment around them so that they can always win. And they have to win at all costs. If people are going to threaten them or challenge them, they'll figure out a way to dismiss them and remove them from the environment if they can't defeat them, and then surround themselves with people who they can easily defeat. And the reason why this occurs is you got to remember that these people with this type of a personality disorder, at their core, people say they're insecure. I would say at their core, they're experiencing a fair amount of threat. And a lot of that threat can be coming from the shadows. Sometimes it's coming here or here, but a lot of it can be coming from these shadows, and they're very unaware of it because the threat exists in the shadows. So they're in kind of a fight or flight response all the time. And the dilemma is, being in flight is really uncomfortable. Being anxious is really uncomfortable. And so, you have to find a way to get to safety. But sometimes the negotiation that should occur for these people to get to a place of safety, to get to a place of actually connecting with people, to get to a place of cooperation is almost impossible because of their personality traits. So what their choice to do is to just boost themselves back up into fight, because dopamine makes them feel good. And remember, dopamine is a cocaine and an amphetamine high. Dopamine hits the pleasure reward centers pretty hard. So these folks, in order not to be in fear and a state of anxiety chronically, or even fall into sort of the freeze and faint physiology of withdrawal and depression, they learn this strategy by which they can get some dopamine and feel good for a while. This sounds like an addict, doesn't it? Feel good for a while by engaging in conflict and competition that they know that they're going to win, because they've rigged the game so that they can always win. So the narcissist becomes very addicted to not only power over people, but to this idea of creating competition and creating conflict so that they can have a victory in the fight, which shoots their dopamine level way up, and they just feel much better. But the problem is that doesn't last. That is not a state that lasts very long. And so it becomes just a repetitive pattern. It's no different than any addict that has to go back to the substance to get the high again, because the high doesn't last long enough. So the narcissist is truly an addict without a substance. Now, when we take these two pictures together, when we take this picture of this prefrontal cortex being offline, somebody who has essentially lost their ability to connect emotionally and has lost their ability to do higher level thinking and be creative, and has lost any insight into why they are the way they are. We can't ask a blind man to see, so it's really hard to fix them. And they're inflexible as well. When you take this, all of these things, and look at what's included in here: no empathy, no remorse, right? And combine them with this illusion of control strategy, a narcissistic strategy to get control in the world, what do you end up getting? The combination of this and this frequently leads to the antisocial personality, or the sociopath. So if you take fight and flight, fight plus flight, and they keep wanting to go back to fight for the dopamine hit, plus narcissism, and you get a sociopath. Isn't that interesting? So these people are really tough to change, right? There's almost nothing that you can do to change them. They are so well defended in these structures and this behavior. They're addicted to this behavior by their dopamine, and they're defended to these strategies for illusion of control in the world. So they are super hard to change. And the only thing that you can do is set appropriate boundaries with them. So if you're feeling like they're stepping all over you, they're crashing into your lane, they're trying to control you, and they are, and you understand trying to fix them or control them back is also going to be somewhat of an illusion. It's going to be very difficult to do. You can then say, okay, I just need to set boundaries with this person. Now they're going to throw a hissy fit if you set a boundary with them, right? But the boundary stays rigid. And if it gets so bad, you walk away, right? You just don't deal with them. If you end up leaving them isolated, if everybody treats them with proper boundaries and they end up being isolated, there is something that can happen to them. They may augur, they may go through a flight phase, a fear, anxiety phase. They may look around trying to get their dopamine hit, but they're not going to get it if everybody's setting good boundaries with them. And they may actually collapse down into freeze and faint physiology. But it is in those moments of freeze and faint physiology where there may be an opportunity when they're fragile and vulnerable in a position of surrender, which is what those physiologies are, for them to work their way back out without recreating their habitual strategies that are so destructive, particularly the people around them, but I don't think they recognize how destructive they are to themselves. I mean, people in general just do not like these people. They may saddle up to them if they're in a position of power and authority and have some control or wealth. But by and large, people simply don't like these people. And interestingly, it's also actually fairly hard for two of these narcissists or potential sociopaths to get along because because of this problem of neither one of them is going to win the battle of control. And so they frequently just can't tolerate each other over time. So again, it becomes very difficult to find a card to play that's going to trump this sociopathic personality, other than simply setting strong boundaries. And if those boundaries aren't holding, then you have to walk away. So, and interestingly, this all starts with threat and is perpetuated by a flow of pro-inflammatory cytokines, what it does to shut off parts of our brain, what they do to our neurotransmitter levels. And, so we tend to look at this personality very negatively, correct? I think it's always important to understand at the root of all of our mental illnesses, all of our personality disorders, all of our addictions, at the root is that chronic threat stress response. And any of us who are put under enough chronic threat stress are going to start exhibiting this stuff. And we may not go to this personality strategy, but we'll probably go to one, and or we may go to substance abuse if we're under enough chronic stress threat. So I think we have to acknowledge that even though this horrible person here that we really struggle with and we have to hold accountable and set boundaries with is still one of us, is still our brother. It could be us in a different situation in the world, and at some level they deserve empathy, kindness, compassion, and love, but none of those should be done to the exclusion of setting proper boundaries and holding them accountable. Because those things are kindness, those things are acts of love, and they can actually allow these people potentially to eventually reach their human potential, to bring this distinctly human part of their brain back online, to be bright, sharp, creative, good judgment, and also to be kind and compassionate and connected and loving. There's still that potential even in these people. It's tough if you can get the threat under control and get them feeling safe. Thank you.